Simon Orchard. Simon was a colleague of mine for some time. We didn't have the opportunity to work together for a very, very long time. It was always a pleasure, Simon, so very glad to have you here. He qualified as a pharmacist and entered the research and development organization of Pfizer in the UK 30 years ago. And after several roles in formulation development, he moved into manufacturing operations where he had a number of increasing responsibility roles in different areas, and he finally became as well the Pfizer quality lead in the UK. Then he was going to Sweden, where he was leading one of the biggest manufacturing sites, the biotech manufacturing sites of Pfizer. And after that, he actually took control of the overall manufacturing network for the biotech products, which is 6 different sites in Pfizer. More recently, he has been leading the product portfolio role in Pfizer, and today he's the head of the supply operations and customer service for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So please welcome Simon Orchard.
Okay, good morning, and thanks, Manel. I think actually Manel's got a greater insight into my career path than I have. He managed to exit Pfizer just before I would have joined the group that Manel was in, so he avoided becoming a close colleague quite successfully there, so well done, Manel. So what I wanted to do this morning is really just kind of share a bit of a story with you. This is not a deep dive into kind of the technology behind supply chain. It's really just a bit of an insight into the journey that Pfizer's been through the last 3 or 4 years within our supply chain excellence program, and some of the reasons and drivers behind that. If you want to get into the real detail behind some of this, there's 1 or 2 colleagues of mine in the audience, and I'm sure they'll be delighted to answer your techie questions. So I'm going to try and keep this as a fairly high-level kind of story and walk through what it is we've been doing. What I'll start off with is just giving you a little bit of business background, so why Pfizer decided to kind of embark on a supply chain excellence journey, and why the kind of the status quo wasn't going to be adequate for us. What I'll do is talk a bit about what we actually did in trying to transform that supply chain. And I think it's worth me saying now that this is still very much a work in progress. I guess if you believe in continuous improvement, you never get to the end anyway. But that aside, we're still working through the journey that we had set out, let alone trying to continuously improve on it. What I'll end up with is trying to talk a bit about our current vision of the orchestrated end-to-end supply chain. Very jargonistic. I think we can thank many of our consulting colleagues for some of the jargon you'll come across today. But essentially, I think we're speaking a similar language when we talk about that end-to-end transparency that we've been aiming for. And then I'll just try and finish up with a few kind of key points around what our next priorities are. I'm not going to get into crystal ball gazing as what the next 10 years might bring. Hopefully they won't affect me too directly, given the length of time I've been in the industry already, but I'll leave that for my successors. But it gives you a little bit of a sense of what Pfizer's next priorities are over the coming year or two. So maybe just to move on to the business background with Pfizer. So for those of you that didn't spend last night reading our annual report, and that's totally understandable, a few facts and figures. So these are from 2013. I won't go through all of them, but just to give you a sense of how big or not Pfizer might be. We had 51 billion in revenue. I think for 2014, it's probably in the high 40 billion, something around that number. And if you see the tag on the bottom there was about 3 billion actually donated in kind of products and cash to NGOs and other organizations around the world. So something that we're kind of very proud of. There's 175 markets where we're actively selling products, and of those 129 we actually have market logistics centers in, so the balance would be essentially distributor markets. Always a moving feast, but around 55, 56 manufacturing sites. You know, it kind of ebbs and flows as we exit some with network strategies and we acquire others with integrations, and recently acquired one in Austria with the integration with Baxter Vaccines. It was 80,000 colleagues roughly in 2013. I think we're probably nearer 75,000 at the moment. And that's from a peak probably 4 years ago of about 120,000. So, quite a significant change in that number. And then how complex is the supply chain? Well, one measure is of course, number of SKUs. I think we're a little better than 23,000 now. We may only be 22,000, but still a relatively large number for a pharma company, and that's driven by around 600 different products. So that gives you a little bit of a flavour of the size of Pfizer and what it is we're trying to change. And I think it's a little bit like the oil tanker analogy. There's a lot of inertia there to get moving in the first place, and it also makes it quite tough to change direction. So when we do try and make major change in the organisation, it doesn't happen overnight, and I'm sure something many of you can relate to. So the next slide, and I'm going to give a little kind of health warning before I put it up, because there was a bit of a debate whether I could even show this slide, because it might upset one or two of you in the audience. But it's essentially the outcome of a benchmarking study we were involved in 3 to 4 years ago, and it gets updated from time to time. And it was in collaboration with a range of external consultants. PwC was certainly one, BCG, I think the others are listed at the bottom of the slide. And what it really does is assesses supply chain maturity of different organizations, okay? And although Pfizer's there, so are a number of the companies represented here. So if you don't like where it shows you on the graph, I didn't put you there. It was as a result of the benchmarking study, okay? So apologies, but that's the slide. So if you happen to be in Teva, J&J, Merck, BMS, sorry, Manel, that's kind of where this supply chain maturity assessment fell out. And we really did this to get a sense of where we stacked up against the industry, the pharma industry, but against supply chains more globally. And in the work stream I was in yesterday, someone made the comment that if you were working in fast-moving consumer goods and were looking for an excellent supply chain professional, would you come and look at the pharma industry for your recruitment? And the feeling was generally no. And I guess this slide kind of speaks to that a little bit. As an industry, supply chains doesn't appear to be where we excel. Okay, we tend to fall towards the lower ends of maturity if you accept the outcome of this study. Some of you may be in denial, as I was when I first saw it, but yeah, okay. I think I can reliably say from those companies that did take part in this, none of the pharma companies at the time of this study were in the 3 to 4 range. And essentially, as you move from left to right, and you probably worked this out, you become more integrated, less standalone silos, more orchestrated, more end-to-end visibility until you get to the likes of a Nike or an Amazon. And we're certainly not there yet. So this was really kind of further fuel to the fire in terms of a belief in Pfizer that supply chain excellence could be a source of value for us. And I think if you think historically, if you're a historian of the pharma industry, around 4 or 5 years ago now, Pfizer and Wyeth integrated, and we had obscenely large synergy targets, I think is the analysts speak for it, but savings targets to you and me. So we needed to generate significant savings in the organization. The headcount reduction I mentioned earlier you saw was one of the outcomes of that. But a piece of it was trying to improve the performance of our supply chain. And as you can probably get from this slide, our target was to try and move towards a level 3 within the supply chain maturity. Okay. So I think where Pfizer was coming from, and probably not unique in its history either, is we were much more focused historically on our logistics operations, the physical movement of stuff, and less around our planning organization. And a personal view, and it's shared by a few of my colleagues, is probably the integration between Pfizer and Wyeth was one of the triggers, not just because of the savings targets, but also because some of the great work that legacy Wyeth have been doing around supply chain excellence, that many of those people came across into Pfizer, brought with them, some of those thoughts and ideas. So it was really I guess you could say, a perfect storm in some ways in terms of a number of triggers to drive the program to start improving performance. So that's a bit about the background and why we wanted to embark on this. So how did we go about it? So really there were 3 strands to this, and I'd love to pretend that 4 years ago we had this perfect picture of what the 4-year strategy looked like and all the executable items. I'd be lying if I told you that was true. We had a pretty good idea what market excellence was going to look like, and the other bits have been more of an organic evolution since then, I suppose. So we had some ideas around what it might look like, but market excellence, which I'll touch on in a moment, was really where we started. So if I pick this first one, market excellence. So this I think is a pretty kind of cool piece of work. It's essentially what it kind of says in the label is trying to drive supply chain excellence within our individual markets. So within Pfizer, demand management within the markets, in most markets at least, sits within the supply chain organization. So one of the things we did is create an in-house supply chain academy. And at the risk of sounding a little arrogant, I think if I look at it now, it would stack up against many external MBA programs. It really is a very, very sophisticated internal development program. And until I took on this role, I was completely oblivious to it. So it's been fairly well hidden and embedded within Pfizer as well. But essentially, it was constructed from some in-house expertise and with some external support as well. So it's a series of modular training and development programs that we've been putting all of our market-based colleagues through to essentially increase the capability and competence in those markets in terms of supply chain. Each of the markets are given a minimum level of performance, and they're assessed against that. They're very welcome to go beyond that minimum level, and many of them have done, which is great to see. But it's essentially around the maturity of the supply chain excellence within those individual markets. The program and the metrics cover a huge range of topics, and I've just touched on a few of them here, but certainly demand management, running S&OP, change management in market, inventory management. On the physical logistics side, certainly security, dangerous goods transport, temperature control, and so on. And then, for me, one of the most important parts has been embedding that. So you can go through these programs, and they're flavor of the month, and they're great for a year or so, and they kind of tail away. So what we've tried to do is to formulate a way of actually ensuring that people and the markets actually maintain that level of performance. So there's a series of metrics there in place which actually continuously audits and measures their performance against these particular requirements. So that's kind of a quick snapshot of market excellence. We don't offer the program to external people. Maybe as the next revenue generation program, we should perhaps try that. But at the moment, purely internal. So moving on. Supply model transformation was the next strand of those 3 kind of transformational pieces. And I guess this is the one I find most difficult to explain, and most people within supply chain in Pfizer would probably find the same challenge. But there were some key elements in it. And one of them was to create a product portfolio management group, which is something I was leading in my last job. And it's a relatively small group. It's around 20 people, and they each have 4, 5, 6 brands each. And they're essentially the product steward for that brand within the manufacturing organization, as supply chain's part of manufacturing. And they're responsible for, if you like, designing that product and managing the product life cycle at a strategic level. What they don't do, or what they shouldn't do, is get involved in day-to-day and month-to-month detailed supply planning. We have other people that are very good at that, so that's not intended as the role for this group. Many of your organizations have something similar. So these were kind of fairly key individuals in terms of bringing some oversight to the management of our portfolios and the life cycle of those individual assets within that. They don't work as individuals. They do have a virtual team, a product team. That could be up to a dozen, 15 people from just about every area of the business you can imagine: regulatory, operations, commercial, medical, sometimes technical support. But really all the functions you might need to manage the product projects through its life cycle. So that was one of the key pieces of supply model transformation. So just to dig a tiny bit deeper into that, and this is kind of partly intended so you can't read it. It's just the kind of the main boxes that are the key ones. So if I was a product portfolio leader and had just been handed a brand, where I would start off is working with the commercial group, looking at their commercial plans for that particular brand. In some cases, probably similar in your organizations, those plans are extremely clear, well laid out, some fantastic long-range volume forecasts. In other cases, we find the product portfolio leader is actually driving commercial to really look beyond next year. So a real mix across the portfolio of products of just how much attention some of those brands have had. But from that commercial plan, what we try and develop is a sense of where we should be taking the product within our supply chain and manufacturing organization. So if I look back historically and coming from an operations background, every plant manager had their key projects around certain products, and they tended to be driven by cost improvements in the plant, yield improvements, some great new technology we could use. What this approach is starting to do now is bringing a more holistic product view. So what does the product need across its life cycle, and reprioritizing and actually drawing to a close some of those pet projects that site leaders always love to have. So it's brought a more strategic view to some of those and actually accelerated other projects where they're a better fit with what commercial are trying to do for the product. So having kind of been through that, and I'm shortcutting a huge amount of data analytics that goes on behind this, you end up with a kind of a strategic product agenda, which is essentially the execution plan for all of these various projects. So they could vary from a major second-generation biotech process introduction to launching a tertiary new market to a packaging artwork change. So certainly vary in depth and complexity. So a little bit about product portfolio management within SMT. One of the things that comes out of that product design process is a sense of where we want the product supply chain to sit. And I think what we've found is our portfolio tends to sit in one of three models. So if you've seen this model before with agility, cost, and service, that the three apexes of the triangles there, I think before we did this, we'd expected more of our products, particularly in the established off-patent group, to be sitting down in the cost area. If we talk to our commercial colleagues, most of them say every product is actually in the center model. Like, we want our product, supply is everything. And for some of our products, that's absolutely true. I guess as a company, we're not prepared to pay the cost of delivering 100% service for all 22,000 SKUs. So we do have some segmentation based on where the product might sit. So if I looked at our oncology portfolio or vaccine portfolio, they very clearly are in the service model, hemophilia, growth hormone, similar type stories there. When I move out from that, particularly into some of our established products, yeah, sure, it moves more towards agility, maybe towards cost, and that certainly would be market and region dependent as well. So it gives you a little bit of a flavor of what some of that portfolio product design work actually gives us an insight into, and where should we be trying to kind of manage our products. So the next piece really takes us on to the orchestrated solution, which is kind of a snapshot of pretty much where we are now in time and what we're trying to do. So, yeah, this is a little bit of a list, but these are the different work streams or elements now that are present as part of the orchestrated network. And you'll see some of them I've touched on, because these are not discrete buckets. They do overlap as time has moved on. So portfolio management is the piece I was just talking about, and that's something that is going to be key for us going forwards. I think probably one of the most significant failings we found internally, I suppose, through that portfolio management work was the lack of attention we were paying to long-range volume forecasting. I guess Pfizer and many of our peers are much better at long-range revenue forecasting, but that's driven by a whole different set of thinking than volume forecasting, as many of you know. And we had lost sight of that, and that has given us some surprises in terms of capacity shortfalls where revenues may look a certain way, but actually volume was very different. We have an example with one of our anti-cholesterol drugs that's recently, or fairly recently, come off patent. Sales went from approximately $12 billion down to about $2 billion, so really big reduction in sales. This year we're producing 5% more than we've ever produced. So the volume and revenue relationship is not always linear, and that's a piece that the portfolio management group have been great in kind of helping identify, but has certainly been something that we need to pay much more attention to. Above-site network planning, that's something I know some of you have been involved with for some time. Outside of the industry, much, much more common, I think. For us, it's a relatively new thing. We're running a couple of pilots this year. And something that I don't see us doing for every market and every region, but I think for some markets, it certainly brings some value. So we're going to be running a pilot in Central and Eastern Europe. They're characterized by being relatively small markets, small numbers of colleagues within those markets working within supply chain, often multitasking. Not easy to develop the level of competence we would like in those smaller markets just because of the number of people. So bringing that into an above-site regional function, we hope, will give us some opportunity to kind of better develop those colleagues and end up with a more robust capability there. At site planning and execution, that's pretty much self-explanatory. The level of capability or competence within our site planning group, so that's the folk in the manufacturing sites, and I'm saying this as an ex-operations person, so the capability within the sites is very variable. We have some outstanding people, and we have some who really need to develop their capability in that area. So that's another area. Market planning, market execution, that's the piece I started with on market excellence. So that is into continuous improvement phase now. We've done a great job in bringing the markets up to a certain standard, and it's the same standard whether you're in Germany or France or West Africa. It really doesn't matter. Intercompany planning and execution, one of my colleagues here, Danny, is looking after that role, and he's in a panel later, so I'll leave him to touch on that piece. But it's essentially the movement of products all around the world within the company, and for something the size of Pfizer, that's a pretty key piece of the operation. Metrics and governance, and I'll show you an example in a moment. I suspect that in developing the metrics and visibility we're doing at the moment, we may be putting more effort into doing that than might be necessary, but we are getting some nice results. The next phase, I think, is looking at how perhaps we can do that more easily with the business technology we have at our hands. And the last two pieces are really kind of much of the same thing. It's around the culture and capabilities. So what does an orchestrated end-to-end supply chain look like? I think within Pfizer manufacturing, people are starting to use the terminology. A lot of those people have no idea what it really means. And I think we're not finding it easy to actually explain at a shop floor level what that actually looks like for folk. So that's a piece of work that's still very much ongoing within creating this network. So I touched on metrics, and again, this is one that you don't need to read the detail, but this is an example of a scorecard we've developed. This is for a particular product. The data, it probably was true on one day for one particular product. I can't remember which day and which product, but across the top, you have the different nodes of the network. So Yeah, here we go. So an API plant, a bulk drug product plant, packaging plant, and a market distribution center. So if you read this metric vertically, it gives you a sense on that first row, that's the inter-node service level. So you can see there in this kind of dummy example, between the tablet site and the packaging site, pretty appalling service level, 13%. So it makes you wonder how on earth that packaging plant delivers 98% customer service to the market, probably with high inventories, I suppose. The next level would be what's the performance to schedule. So you can kind of work through this, that the next row would be inventory and demand and supply planning, and it goes on through lead times, system health checks, so kind of master data health checks, and planning and system capability. So it's, once you've got used to reading these, you can see at a fairly quick glance how that product is actually performing within our supply chain at a given point in time. We do not have this for every one of the 600 products, but we are developing it for, it's a bit of an 80-20 rule, so it's much less than 20% of our products deliver 80% of our revenue. So the good news is we don't have to develop 120 of these. So, okay, and just a word or two on the future before I finish. So as I say, this is not a crystal ball for the industry 10 years out. It's really just what we're going to be focusing on over the next year or two. So certainly more refinement of the tool sets we're using. Some of the behaviors, working in a different way than we have been, clearer definitions of some of the roles of our colleagues in our supply chain, and the governance and measurement around that, and those metrics are one example of that. More use of centres of excellence, so I touched on regional planning hubs earlier. As I say, I don't believe we'll have them everywhere, so if you're in one of the big 5 markets in Europe, I wouldn't imagine we'll be doing regional planning. If you're in Central and Eastern Europe, yeah, more likely. Looking again at in-house versus external providers, we're looking at starting some postponement activity this year, and I guess it would be another presentation to go into why we're doing that. And again, looking at whether we keep that in-house or go to third parties for that. Enabling technology, there's obviously a number of providers out in the hall here that we'll be talking to around how they can help us on this journey. Late-stage customization I've just mentioned. So there's some of the things that we're actually looking at and starting with either pilots or progressing with during the next year or two. So that's really the end of the presentation, the kind of story of our transformation journey. So happy to take any questions now, or you can catch me during the breaks or at lunch. So open to questions. Or not. There's one down here. Okay.
For the questions, please raise your hand and wait until the mic is coming in. Thank you.
Hello, Mike Owls from International Health Partners. I used to be very involved in supply chain with Sanofi before I left to join this charity. But one thing that I find is the connection between marketing and supply chain. Do you feel that what you've done is achieving the buy-in from marketing, the understanding from marketing? And I know that certain companies are now becoming much more joined up in their international view of product launches and using information so that you can actually track what's happening of a product launch. And do you find that that system is enabling you to have a better platform within the marketing domain?
Yeah, so it sounds like a set-up question, actually. So the short answer is yes. I think we have a number of kind of business processes, I guess, in place that help that relationship between supply chain and marketing. If I go back to the product portfolio management group that are managing the life cycle of the product, they get involved prior to launch, 6-9 months prior to launch. And within that product team I mentioned that the portfolio leader runs, we always have a commercial presence, generally the global asset team leader for marketing. So that kind of touches on the global view of that product-market interaction. When you get down to the individual regions and markets, we would look then more towards our regional and market S&OP processes for some of that market interaction. We also then have kind of a series of what we call kind of key contacts, so regional commercial presidents for each of our 5 business units have a key go-to person within the manufacturing organization. So I'm the person for Europe and Middle East and Africa at the moment, for example. So that's certainly been a significant step forwards in that relationship. You can always do better, but I think by embedding it in some ongoing business processes, it certainly strengthened those relationships. Yeah. Maybe one last question, given there's a minute left. Okay, there's one right centre, or left centre. Oh. I understand you're from BMS, so I hope I didn't upset you.
Well, you have good eyes, actually. Yeah, the question is about sustainability. So, lot of things, huge company, lots of things you're trying to do the right things, by the way, obviously, but how do you think to assure sustainability of the improvement you are creating?
Yeah, it's a great question, and for me, it's the most difficult piece because it is such a large organisation. 55 manufacturing sites, and so I think it's by putting in governance processes, very clear metrics that measure those, and using those metrics as part of that governance process. So it's not so much name and shame, because what we're trying to drive, this sounds very jargony, but is this kind of ownership culture where the individual nodes in the network, the global brand supplier leaders, they have true ownership for the metrics they're impacting, the markets that are driving those market excellence metrics, and that they actually become proud. So, we have like a recognition program. So once a year when we have our annual meeting, the markets that have performed especially well that year against an incredible array of metrics are kind of publicly recognized. And I think, they get some real pride out of being given, the President's Award or, the Platinum Award or whatever it might be. So I think there's many things we're trying to do, but I think sustainability is always tough when there's so many competing priorities, and it just takes energy and effort and persistence and then some good governance, I think. Okay, I think I should probably call that the end. Okay, thank you.